From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It may be hard to believe, a lot's happened in the last few weeks, but it's only been a month since Inauguration Day in the United States, when former presidents, billionaire tech bros, and members of the new administration gathered to watch the 47th president take office.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, the Honorable Donald John Trump.
Trump's guests on the day have been described as a who's who of right-wing politics. The Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, Argentina's Javier Milei, Keir Starmer, famously, didn't make the cut. But perhaps surprisingly, someone from Labour did.
Only 700 people were in that Capitol Rotunda. One of them, the only Labour politician in that room, he was a man called Maurice Glasman.
Maurice Glasman, a Labour member of the House of Lords, was at the inauguration as a guest of the new Vice President.
In Glasman, Vance saw the blueprint for a new kind of politics that mixed traditional left-wing and right-wing positions to speak to people like those he'd grown up with.
So who is Maurice Glasman? And what does his presence at the inauguration tell us about the future direction of the Labour Party? The story today: how a Labour politician inspired JD Vance.
I'm Patrick Maguire. I'm a political columnist for The Times. I've written 2 books about the Labour Party, and I spend my working week speaking to people inside Downing Street, inside the cabinet, Labour MPs, anyone who works for the Labour Party, trying to find out what the party thinks, where it's going, and who the Prime Minister is listening to.
Patrick, you told us about the most unlikely presence at the inauguration of Donald Trump, a Labour politician a lot of people won't have heard of. So tell us about Maurice Glasman. Who is he?
Well, to answer that question, you have to go back to London in the middle of the 20th century, a very different world. When listeners think of Hackney or Dalston now, they are trendy places. But Maurice Glasman is a sort of son of that old East End, the son of Jewish immigrants, the son of a toy maker in the East End of London. He's a chain-smoking philosopher who plays the jazz trumpet. He is born of an era of Labour politics that has basically passed into history in a way of working class life that doesn't really exist in this country anymore. And he spent a long career, most of his adult life, out of the view, out of sight and out of mind of Westminster, theorising on where the left, the centre-left, the mainstream left was going wrong. But in 2010, he burst into the mainstream of British politics with his unique project, Blue Labour, and has never really gone away since, and recently has returned with something of a vengeance.
Before we get on to that, at a time when the government seems to be looking for bridges to the new Trump administration in America, it turns out Nigel Farage isn't the only British politician to have found favour out there. Just tell us why Maurice Glasman was at the inauguration.
So this all started with an email chain after JD Vance, who was then a venture capitalist and media personality, published a book called Hillbilly Elegy around 2015, 2016. It was a memoir of growing up in the Rust Belt in Ohio, in a place that had lost its sense of economic and political purpose. Middletown, once the backbone of industrial America, had since collapsed into poverty and problems of substance abuse. JD Vance had a very difficult childhood with a mother addicted to opioids, living on food stamps.
The thing I try to really hammer home in the book is that this is a sort of all of the above type of problem. It's not just that government has failed us. It's not just that we failed ourselves. It's government, it's individuals, it's sort of everything in between, from families and communities and neighborhoods, churches and so forth.
And it was a book that was very much of its time because towns like Middletown, the name itself says everything, they had once been the very core of the Democratic base. Steel factories, heavily unionised jobs, all of that had gone, and they turned to Donald Trump. And JD Vance, now the Vice President, of course, had a real moment. He was the sort of spokesman, partly unwittingly, for Trump's America. He seemed to be a prophet for the age.
How do you explain the attraction of Donald Trump to them?
I think it's a very complicated phenomenon. It's difficult to understand why so many of these folks have been attracted to Donald Trump. But a big part of it is the way that he conducts himself. He is relatable in a way that you might talk about politics around the dinner table. But there's also a sense that people just feel ignored by the political class.
And it seemed like everybody in politics in the English-speaking world was reading that book at the time, and JD Vance didn't quite know what to do with his fame. He's obviously a very politically engaged and driven guy, an ambitious guy, and he started casting around for ideas about how he might translate that sort of critical acclaim and momentum in the media to political ends. And he sent an email out of the blue, unsolicited, to a man he didn't know, and that man was Maurice Glasman.
JD Vance, when he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, sent it to me. Yeah. No idea who he was, but like you, I'm a good well-brought-up boy from North London, so I wrote him a thank you email, saying it was a very interesting book, and we exchanged a few emails.
Now, JD Vance had spotted that Glasman had spent the best part of that decade running Blue Labour, the blue as in blue collar, but also the colour we associate with conservatism, of course. And it seemed to Vance that Glasman grasped something that Democrats didn't, and most of the Labour Party didn't, which was their traditional working class voters in towns that voted reliably for the centre-left. They can no longer take them for granted. And he also asked words to the effect of, do you think I should try and do something similar with the Democrats, i.e. shake them out of their stupor and say, these are the voters that matter. You've lost sight of these people. You need a politics that responds to them.
I said, good luck with that. I'm having a hard enough time with a party called Labour to get the Labour interest, working class interest. We exchanged 2 or 3 emails, fell down the memory hole, so imagine my surprise when he became Vice President of the United States in the Republican Party.
I think we can now tell which answer JD Vance settled on, but it just goes to show there was a sort of feeling of transatlantic kinship between Vance and Glasman. In Glasman, Vance saw the blueprint for a new kind of politics that mixed traditional left-wing and right-wing positions to speak to people like those he'd grown up with.
To understand Glasman's appeal, both in bits of America, but also why he's suddenly being talked about here again, take us back to the idea he represents, Blue Labour. You mentioned that this is a name that comes partly from the idea of the blue-collar worker, partly from the Tory party. So what exactly is Blue Labour and how did it come about?
Well, to answer that question, we have to, I'm afraid, go back to the very early part of the 20th century for a whistle-stop history lesson.
Go for it.
It would be my honour. So the Labour Party has a strange and difficult birth because from the outset it represents very different traditions in left-wing politics. You have middle-class progressives, you have the trade unions, who at that time were representative of the organised industrial working class, and you also had the radical left, the far left. You had communists, you had avowed Marxists, right? So this is a very uneasy mixture of people. And over the course of the few decades after its founding in 1906, these different constituent parts of the Labour Party are always vying for supremacy. But Glasman's diagnosis Blue Labour's diagnosis is, in 1945, when the Labour Party wins that landslide majority after the war, a particular tendency wins out, and that is of people who think nationalisation, economics, taxing and spending is the be-all and end-all of improving working class conditions, welfare state, etc., etc. But what Glasman would say was missing from Labour there on in was a sort of understanding of Labour's ethical and moral core, which was always about, in his view, mutual responsibility, the dignity of work, community.
I call it the politics of the common good. And it begins with the idea that the progressive left has got human nature completely wrong, and it rejects the fundamentals of capitalism because capitalism wishes to turn nature and human beings into commodities. So that's clearly such a fundamental category error.
So those are Maurice Glasman's beliefs as an academic. What happens in 2010 that allows that to become a much more active movement within the Labour Party?
Something that Labour people never thought would happen before, which was Labour's middle-class vote for the first time exceeded the votes it had won from its working-class base. Glasman goes, aha, I was right all along. And by then, people agree with him. And so Ed Miliband becomes Labour leader in 2010, not his brother. And that's significant because Ed Miliband is the candidate who gets up and says, we've had a great run, guys, but God, we've got so much wrong. We need to move on from New Labour and we need to look at this from first principles. Now, Ed Miliband is a very cerebral guy. He reads voraciously. And it's around that time he comes across the work of Maurice Glasman. So what did Ed Miliband do? He looked at Maurice Glasman and thought, this is the philosophy that could help us remake ourselves. It could help us reconnect with political voters. And that's what happens in 2010. Maurice Glasman goes from being so obscure that he's broke, his wife's having to look at taking work in a supermarket, to getting a peerage and becoming Ed Miliband's guru. And for a period, Blue Labour, Blue seems to replace New in how the Labour Party is configuring and orienting itself.
So talk us through the Blue Labour prescription. What were Maurice Glasman's ideas for winning the working class voters, the traditional Labour base, winning them back?
Well, it was an emphasis on things that New Labour had turned its back on. So it was at once a shift to the right on some questions of culture, identity, migration, but also a shift to the left on economics. So that meant quite robust language on migration. I mean, Glasman fell out with a lot of people when he appeared to suggest that he was supportive of a total ban on migration and was talking very favourably about what we now know as Brexit in the early 2010s. But also, Blue Labour were talking about policies such as, let's put fans on the boards of football clubs because too many clubs are going bust, because foreign owners are eroding the identity of the English game, and that's a big source of civic pride. That was the sort of agenda that was always Blue Labour's more interesting and creative thinking that sometimes gets neglected. It's that sort of, to put it crudely but simply, moving right on culture and left on the economy and emphasising the roles of things that aren't government: faith, family, voluntary associations, community. These are values that often are neglected, treated as inherently Tory by some people on the left.
While expressing his ideas around Blue Labour, he did sometimes court controversy with some of his policies. Just tell us how some of his comments about immigration and working women did get him into trouble.
Yes, well, the problem with bringing someone like Maurice Glasman into a political project, you have a very outspoken guy, a self-identified iconoclast who is getting up and saying stuff like, this Tommy Robinson guy seems interesting. We abhor street violence, obviously, but they're obviously tapping into something. Why doesn't the Labour Party have a dialogue with, in his words, more moderate members of the English Defence League? There were also, as you say, comments about white working class men in particular are disenfranchised is because their whole way of life has collapsed. And now a traditional left-wing answer to that might be, well, of course, 50 years ago they would have had jobs in heavy industry, working men's club, unionised jobs, a secure existence. Glasman would say things like, and also women have growing independence and that the traditional male role has been eroded by that.
And that for him is a problem.
Yeah, and that for him is not a sociological observation. It is something that politicians should maybe think about resolving. And that's one of the issues where if you listen to him and you listen to MPs on the sort of radical right of the Conservative Party, you'd probably find them quite difficult to distinguish.
And you can see why it didn't go down very well with a lot of people within the Labour Party, particularly the Labour MP Diane Abbott, for example.
Blue Labour wraps itself in a sort of Hovis commercial nostalgia for the world we have lost. And it refers a lot to the past and to tradition. And it's not my history, it's not my tradition. What it is an exclusively white male version of Labour's past.
Did that help to end the Blue Labour surge for a while?
Yeah, look, I think people around Ed Miliband eventually came to the view that Maurice Glasman was too much of a liability, that if he had some sort of official role within Ed Miliband's office and he was willing to say these things, it would inevitably be taken as the view of the leader. And by the 2015 election, Labour strategists came to believe that actually the Liberal Democrats' vote had collapsed to such an extent that they might be the primary beneficiaries of that, and they didn't necessarily need to think too hard about a lot of these questions. And so Blue Labour, even with Brexit and even though its politics seemed to be having a bit of a moment, shrunk into the background because nobody was less Blue Labour, despite his economic radicalism, than Jeremy Corbyn. Corbynism to the Blue Labour gang represented everything they didn't like, that everything they thought was wrong about the Labour Party, even if they might have agreed with him on questions such as economics and Brexit.
Patrick, having surged ahead under Ed Miliband, Blue Labour suddenly seemed to be taking a back seat. And now, not only is it coming back as far as the Trump administration is concerned, but it seems to be having a bit of a resurgence here. And that's mostly because Lord Glasman seems to have found a new fan in Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney. Now, we've talked about him before. You've written a book in which he features large. Just remind us a bit about who he is and why he's become such a fan of Lord Glasman.
Well, it's interesting that you should say new fan. Morgan McSweeney has known Maurice Glasman for a very long time, longer than he's known Keir Starmer. Indeed, it was only last week that Maurice Glasman said, Morgan is one of us. And that's because Morgan McSweeney, despite lots of people imagining him as part of the Blairite supremacy inside Downing Street, actually lived the period that Blue Labour was a response to. He was an organiser in Tony Blair's electoral machine, a very tiny cog, going out into a country that was falling out of love with New Labour. So Morgan McSweeney was very, very involved in Blue Labour's early conversations. He knew all of the people involved. He knew Maurice Glasman. As Morgan McSweeney is thinking about these questions with even more urgency after Corbyn, it's people like Maurice Glasman he's talking to, because what comes after it has to be a politics, in Morgan McSweeney's view, that reconnects the Labour Party with the very voters Blue Labour's been banging on about for so long.
And that's become quite an urgent problem for the Starmer government now because of reform. Talk us through that. How urgent a concern is reform for Downing Street?
Well, look, very. You speak to political strategists in Downing Street, and there was a period for a couple of months where they said, look, it's far too early to tell whether we should think of the next election as Keir Starmer versus Kemi Badenoch or Keir Starmer versus Nigel Farage. If you look at the polls, Reform ahead in most of them now, they've settled on it's Keir Starmer versus Nigel Farage.
Reform UK in the lead. Only by a little bit and only after a small change, but Reform UK in the latest voting intention poll are on 25%, overtaking Labour, who were top, who are on 24%. The Tories down in third on 21%.
This is, as Ed Miliband told the cabinet a couple of months ago, centrism's last chance against the radical right. And there is an awareness too that the victory Labour won last July was broad, but it was shallow. The Labour Party didn't convert these people, particularly in what we now call the Red Wall, back to Labour overnight. It was a transactional thing. They were fed up with the Tories and wanted to kick them out. And if Labour doesn't deliver material improvements to their lives, doesn't begin to speak and act like them, doesn't cut migration, etc., it will fail. So it's no surprise that Morgan McSweeney has picked up the phone or has answered the calls of the people he's known for a very long time, because the alternative is Farage sweeps the board in seats Labour once owned and has only just got back on retainer.
So there are people within the Labour Party who think Blue Labour is the answer to keeping those red wall seats, those seats which were traditionally Labour, went Tory under Boris Johnson, but have sort of found their way back, could potentially go reform next time if something isn't done. We are seeing this group of Blue Labour emerge, but some people have already said that some of these MPs, the policies that they're talking about, their talking points, can look like a real dog whistle to the right. What do you make of that?
The first thing to say is there are only a handful of MPs who are out and proud Blue Labourites. There's about 5 of them. To return to what's becoming a theme throughout this conversation, they're all men. 2 of them are called Jonathan. There's more Jonathans than women. And they all represent seats, though, in post-industrial England, in deep England, places like Pendle, Hartlepool, Liverpool Walton, the poorest constituency in Liverpool, where the traditional working class are having a really tough time and are either attracted by reform or, worse still, are not voting at all. Worse still in the eyes of the Labour Party, that is. But as you say, there's a fine line in the eyes of some Labour people between saying, yes, we get it, Trump spoke to voters such as ours, we need to respond to those concerns, and saying, as Maurice Glasman did, actually all the intellectual energy and moral momentum is now with the MAGA movement, and we need to, in his words, build a house on the left side of the MAGA square and sort of ditch the Labour Party entirely.
I just love the working class. When I talk to working class people, they're ambitious. They want England mega, make England great again. It's going to be big.
Blue Labour people are, railing against, as the chairman of the Blue Labour caucus, Dan Carden, has, railing against progressives and woke. Obviously, many of their Labour colleagues go, well, hang on, we're progressives, we're a bit woke. Isn't that sort of the point of us? And it's that real sort of tension. Keir Starmer in 2020 was talking about defending migrants' rights and freedom of movement. Now he's taking soundings from people who have really robust views on this. Even if we say Maurice Glasman doesn't speak for Number 10, he's in and out of Number 10 saying things that would horrify a lot of Labour MPs.
And Dan Carden, who you mentioned, was seen by many to be the person who basically inspired Elon Musk's rants about grooming gangs, which then fed into the political picture here.
Yeah, indeed. Dan Carden voiced his support for a inquiry into grooming gangs that a lot of people on the Labour Party saw as a concession to far-right agenda. And Elon Musk tweeted saying, what a brave guy. Not something I think that thrilled Dan Carden, but he was unapologetic.
So there you already have Elon Musk on board. We know JD Vance is a fan. You mentioned the Glasman idea that you really want to set up the Labour Party as the left side of the MAGA square. Do we think Morgan McSweeney has looked at Donald Trump and thought that's what we need to emulate? And if so, how does that translate here? What does that look like?
It looks a little bit implausible, is the truthful answer, with Keir Starmer in his own version of the MAGA hat. I don't think that's going to happen. Morgan McSweeney told colleagues that he thought Donald Trump's inauguration speech was impressive just because it very clearly diagnosed what was wrong and very clearly communicated that other politicians hadn't listened, but Donald Trump was, and he was going to fix it.
We have a government that has given unlimited funding to the defense of foreign borders, but refuses to defend American borders or, more importantly, its own people.
Now, whether he can is another question. Whether Labour agrees with his prescriptions is another. Lots of people would say the answer to that is no and no. But regardless, I think it is that feeling that Trump's second victory was the final canary in the coal mine and that Labour needs to do something to respond to the same questions. But just how they can take inspiration from MAGA without, one, unconvincingly parroting it, and two, Keir Starmer undergoing another dramatic personality change that convinces no one is another question.
And just finally, next week we're expecting Keir Starmer to come face to face with Donald Trump. How much of this, the blue Labour agenda, how much of this do you think will shape that meeting?
I suspect Lord Glasman will be on the phone to Morgan McSweeney for quite some time ahead of that meeting as they're working out what the Prime Minister can say that congratulates this notoriously modest president on his electoral triumph and suggests Labour is learning the lessons from that triumph without necessarily being seen to endorse it. I think there will be a distinctly bluish tinge to whatever Keir Starmer says about Donald Trump next week.
That was Patrick Maguire, political columnist at The Times and the author of 2 books on Labour, including the most recent, Get In, the inside story of Labour under Starmer, which is available now through The Times bookshop. We'll put a link to it in the description of this podcast. The producer today was Emily Webb, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts and send us your thoughts to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening.